Judge Harrison's smirk disappeared when the 16-year-old defendant started quoting Supreme Court cases that exposed the corruption in his own courtroom. The Atlanta Municipal Court buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Lawyers in expensive suits rushed past metal detectors, their briefcases bulging with papers that would decide people's fates. But Marcus Jefferson didn't have a fancy suit or a leather briefcase. He stood alone at the defendant's table in a clean white shirt and his school tie, hands steady despite the weight of the moment. Judge Richard Harrison glanced at the case file without really reading it. Another juvenile case, another waste of his time. 25 years on the bench had taught him everything he needed to know about these cases. Or so he thought. "Let's make this quick," Harrison drawled, not bothering to hide his boredom. "Truancy, disturbing the peace, and resisting arrest. How do you plead?" Marcus lifted his chin. "Before I enter a plea, Your Honor, I'd like to address the court's jurisdiction under Thompson v. Oklahoma regarding the prosecution of minors without proper representation." The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. The court reporter's fingers froze over her keyboard. Judge Harrison's smirk faltered for just a second before returning, sharper this time. "Son, this isn't a law school classroom. If you can't afford an attorney—" "With all due respect, Your Honor," Marcus cut in, his voice steady, "the court hasn't properly established whether I can or cannot afford one. According to Gideon Vowles Wainwright and subsequent cases, it's the court's duty to ensure—" "Young man," Harrison's voice cracked like a whip, "I don't need a civics lesson from a truant teenager." Marcus didn't flinch. "Then perhaps you need a reminder about Powell v. Alabama, where the Supreme Court ruled that rushing defendants to trial without properly ensuring their right to counsel is a direct violation of the 14th Amendment." The gallery had gone completely silent. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Reynolds was staring at Marcus with undisguised shock. Even the usually stoic bailiff couldn't hide his surprise. Judge Harrison's face darkened. "I'm warning you. I'd also like to enter into evidence," Marcus continued, pulling out a worn notebook. "Documentation of systematic disparities in how this court handles juvenile cases based on racial demographics." Harrison's gavel slammed down so hard the sound echoed through the courtroom. "That's enough." But Marcus was already walking forward, his notebook open. "Over the past 6 months, Your Honor, you've presided over 124 juvenile cases. In cases involving white defendants, you've dismissed 73% without prosecution. For black defendants, that number drops to 12%. The color drained from Harrison's face. "Where did you get those numbers?" "Public record, Your Honor. I've spent every afternoon for the past 3 months in the courthouse archive. It's amazing what you can learn when people think you're just another kid doing homework." Assistant DA Reynolds had gone very still, her face unreadable. Several attorneys in the gallery were whispering among themselves, casting furtive glances at the judge. Marcus turned to face the room. "I also found interesting patterns in sentencing. White juveniles averaged community service and probation. Black juveniles were 3 times more likely to face detention even for identical charges." Judge Harrison's hands were shaking now, but not from anger. Something else had crept into his expression. Fear. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, "I've documented numerous instances where Your Honor failed to inform defendants of their rights, rushed through probable cause hearings, and denied counsel to juveniles who explicitly requested it." "This is outrageous," Harrison sputtered, but his voice had lost its authority. "No, Your Honor," Marcus replied quietly. "What's outrageous is a justice system that doesn't deliver justice. What's outrageous is a judge who sees the law as a weapon instead of a shield." The tension in the courtroom was electric. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the usual shuffling of papers had ceased. Marcus pulled out one final document. "I've prepared a formal complaint for the Judicial Qualification Commission, complete with statistical analysis, case citations, and witness statements from former defendants. But before I submit it," he paused, looking directly at Judge Harrison. The older man's face had gone ashen. "I have a proposition that might interest you, Your Honor, one that could either expose decades of judicial misconduct or help fix a broken system." Assistant DA Reynolds leaned forward, her professional mask cracking to reveal genuine curiosity. The reporters in the back row were scribbling furiously in their notepads. Judge Harrison gripped his gavel like a lifeline, his knuckles white. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What exactly are you proposing?" The courtroom held its breath as Marcus opened another folder. His hands were steady, but his heart thundered in his chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every kid who'd ever stood where he was standing, facing a system that had already decided their fate. 3 months ago, Marcus began, his voice cutting through the silence. My brother James stood in this exact spot. He was 17, an honor student with a scholarship to Howard University. Judge Harrison's face twitched with recognition. Marcus noticed. "You remember him, don't you, Your Honor? The boy you sentenced to 6 months in juvenile detention for disturbing the peace. When all he did was try to stop a fight he didn't start." The judge's fingers drummed against his desk. "That case is closed. James lost his scholarship," Marcus continued, his voice growing harder. "Lost his chance at college. Lost everything because you didn't even bother to watch the security footage that proved his innocence." Assistant DA Reynolds was typing rapidly on her phone, probably pulling up the case file. Her eyes widened as she read. Marcus pulled out a USB drive. "The footage you never watched? I found it. And not just from James's case. I found security footage from 27 cases where you rushed to judgment. 27 lives you changed without even looking at the evidence." Harrison's face had gone from ashen to red. "You illegally obtained—" "Nothing illegal about submitting public records requests, Your Honor. I learned that from Mrs. Reynolds." All eyes turned to the assistant DA, who straightened in her chair. "I never—" "You didn't know it was me," Marcus said softly. "Remember that high school intern who kept asking questions about public records law? Who stayed late to help file documents? Who brought you coffee every morning and listened to you talk about proper legal procedure?" Reynolds' mouth fell open. Other pieces were falling into place. The long hours Marcus had spent in the courthouse, always polite, always helpful, always watching. "Your own staff helped me build this case, Your Honor," Marcus continued, "not because they knew what I was doing, but because they never thought to question why a black teenager would want to learn about the law." The irony hung heavy in the air. "But here's what really interests me." Marcus pulled out yet another document. "Your record before 2010. Hundreds of cases where you showed real justice, real compassion. Something changed that year. Something made you start seeing defendants differently." Harrison's face went completely still. In the gallery, an elderly clerk gasped softly. 2010 was when your son was killed," Marcus said, his voice gentler now. "Killed by a young black man in a carjacking gone wrong. And ever since then—" "Don't you dare," Harrison whispered, but the threat in his voice had been replaced by something raw and broken. "Ever since then, every young black man who stands before you looks like your son's killer. I understand that pain, Your Honor, but understanding it doesn't make it right." Marcus stepped closer to the bench. "I spent 3 months building this case not to destroy you, but to show you what you've become, to show you how grief turned into bias, and bias into injustice." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the usual creaking of chairs had stopped. Everyone was frozen watching this extraordinary scene unfold. "So here's my proposition," Marcus said, laying his notebook on the judge's bench. "Work with me. Help me create a program for judicial oversight and reform. Use your experience, your influence, to fix what's broken. Turn this moment into something that helps people instead of hurts them." Harrison stared at the notebook, then at Marcus. For the first time, he seemed to really see the young man standing before him, not as a defendant, not as a stereotype, but as someone who had done what no one else dared: hold up a mirror to justice itself. Assistant D.A. Reynolds stood up. "Your Honor, given these revelations, I move to—" But before she could finish, the courtroom doors burst open. A tall man in an expensive suit strode in, flanked by two others carrying briefcases. "Marcus Jefferson," the man called out. "I'm Benjamin Crawford from the Southern Justice Initiative. We've been monitoring your investigation for weeks, and we have a few questions for Judge Harrison, too." Marcus turned back to the judge, whose face had become unreadable. This was the moment everything would change, for better or worse. The question was, which path would Harrison choose? Judge Harrison's hands trembled as he removed his glasses. The courtroom waited, suspended in that moment between chaos and revelation. But what happened next shocked everyone, even Marcus. "My son's name was Michael," Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was 24, a law student." His eyes met Marcus's. "Just like you want to be." Marcus hadn't expected this. The judge's vulnerability cut through his carefully constructed case like a knife through paper. "Every night," Harrison continued, "I see his face, but you're right. I've been seeing it in all the wrong places." He picked up Marcus's notebook with shaking hands. "These numbers, these lives I've ruined. This isn't what Michael would have wanted." Benjamin Crawford from the Southern Justice Initiative stepped forward. "Your Honor, we have documented evidence of judicial misconduct spanning—" "I know what you have," Harrison cut him off, standing slowly, "and I'll save you the trouble of a lengthy investigation." He turned to face the packed gallery. "I, Richard James Harrison, hereby confess to allowing personal bias to influence my judicial decisions. I acknowledge my failure to uphold the constitutional rights of defendants in my courtroom." The reporters' cameras clicked frantically. Crawford's team exchanged glances. This wasn't how these confrontations usually went, but Marcus saw something in Harrison's eyes that the others missed. A glimpse of the judge he used to be, fighting to break free from the prison of his own prejudice. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, his voice growing stronger, "I move to immediately review every case I've presided over since 2010. Every sentence, every ruling, every life I've impacted through my failure to deliver true justice." Assistant D.A. Reynolds stood up. "Your Honor, the implications of such a review—" "Will be massive," Harrison finished for her. "Careers will be affected. The system will be disrupted. Good. It needs to be disrupted." He turned back to Marcus. "You didn't just build a case against me, did you? You built a case for redemption. You're showing me there's a way to honor Michael's memory that doesn't involve destroying more lives." Marcus nodded slowly. "Justice and vengeance aren't the same thing, Your Honor." Just then, the courtroom doors opened again. A young man in an orange jumpsuit was led in, hands cuffed. James Jefferson, Marcus's brother. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrison demanded. Benjamin Crawford stepped forward. "We took the liberty of having James Jefferson transferred here. Given the circumstances, we believe his case deserves immediate review." Marcus's heart stopped. He hadn't known about this part. His brother looked thinner, harder, the light in his eyes dimmed by months in detention. But when James saw Marcus standing at the judge's bench, a spark of that light returned. Harrison looked between the brothers, then at his own reflection in the window. In the glass, he could see the ghost of what he'd become and the shadow of what he could be again. "Remove those handcuffs," he ordered. The bailiff hesitated, then complied. "James Jefferson," Harrison's voice filled the courtroom, "in light of new evidence and my own grievous errors in judgment, I hereby vacate your sentence effective immediately." James's knees buckled. Marcus rushed to catch him, the brothers clutching each other as years of pain and injustice began to crack and crumble. But Harrison wasn't finished. He turned to Benjamin Crawford. "Mr. Crawford, I'm prepared to offer my full cooperation with your investigation. More than that, I want to work with your organization. Help me establish a review board for judicial bias. Let me use my experience, my failure, to prevent others from making the same mistakes." Crawford's eyebrows shot up. This was unprecedented. A judge not only admitting bias, but actively working to combat it? Marcus stepped forward, still holding his brother. "That's exactly what I was hoping for, Your Honor. Not just justice for the past, but protection for the future." Harrison nodded, then did something no one expected. He stood up, removed his judicial robe, and laid it carefully on his chair. "I'll be recusing myself from the bench until the review is complete," he announced. "And Marcus," he extended his hand, "thank you for showing me that it's never too late to choose justice over judgment." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Reporters were already rushing for the doors, eager to break the story. But in that moment, 3 lives had been transformed. A brother saved, a judge redeemed, and a young man who proved that true justice requires both courage and compassion. Benjamin Crawford cleared his throat. "This is just the beginning. The real work starts now." And as Marcus looked around the courtroom, at his freed brother, at the humbled judge, at the dawn of real change, he knew Crawford was right. This wasn't an ending, it was a revolution. 1 month later, the same courtroom looked completely different. The wooden benches were packed with young faces, students from every high school in Atlanta. They watched intently as Marcus Jefferson stood at the podium, but this time he wasn't defending himself. He was teaching. "The law isn't just words in books," Marcus explained, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "It's a living thing, and like anything alive, it needs people to help it grow, to help it become better." In the back of the courtroom, James sat in a fresh Howard University sweatshirt. His scholarship had been reinstated. Next to him, their mother wiped tears from her eyes, watching her sons rewrite their story. Former Judge Harrison, now Professor Harrison at Atlanta Law School, stood at the back watching his own redemption unfold. The Judicial Review Board he'd helped establish had already identified 37 cases requiring immediate review. Lives were being restored, one verdict at a time. "But here's what nobody tells you," Marcus continued, pulling out his worn notebook. "Change doesn't always need an army. Sometimes it just needs one person willing to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" He held up the notebook. "These aren't just statistics. Each number is a person, a dream, a future that deserves a chance, and now..." The doors burst open. Benjamin Crawford walked in, followed by a stream of people, former defendants whose cases were being reviewed. Among them was a familiar face, Michael Harrison Jr.'s widow. She walked straight to Professor Harrison, took his hand, and faced the crowd. "My husband believed in justice," she said, her voice strong. "Real justice, the kind that heals instead of hurts. And today, watching his father help restore that justice. I know Michael would be proud." Harrison's hands trembled as he gripped the back of a bench. The weight of his past choices still haunted him, but now those ghosts were becoming guides, showing him how to do better. Marcus turned to the students. You might think you're too young to make a difference, too small to challenge the system. But let me tell you something. He walked down the aisle, making eye contact with each young face. A month ago, I was just a kid with a notebook and a brother who'd been wronged. Today, we're changing how justice works in this city. And tomorrow? But before he could finish, something extraordinary happened. One by one, students stood up, pulling out their own notebooks. They'd been documenting their own stories, their own experiences with injustice. They were ready to continue what Marcus had started. The revolution wasn't ending. It was multiplying. So here's my question to you, Marcus said, turning to face the camera directly for the first time. What injustice will you stand up against? What wrong will you make right? Drop a comment below and tell me your story. Because change isn't just about one person or one courtroom. He held up his notebook one last time. It's about all of us. Professor Harrison stepped forward, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. The former adversaries, now partners in reform, stood together as living proof that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. Like this video if you believe in second chances. Subscribe if you want to see more stories of everyday people changing the system. And remember, sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions. What injustice will you challenge today?